I was very happy, but also somewhat surprised to receive an invitation to come speak to a student group pulled together by Taylor, because Taylor's background is, I'm pretty sure, focused. I'm sure Taylor does other things. I've seen you write about India and various other things, but mostly in East Asia, and especially in China. And so my book is not, except in the most peripheral way, about East Asia or China. However, there is a strand of my book which relates to East Asia and China, and I'm not sure to what extent, if any, Taylor was aware of this, but the sort of kernel of the idea that put me on the path to this book originates in my work on my most immediate prior book, which is a book about Chinese history and about the way China has processed in the past and more recently its own sense of self as a power, meaning world power. And in the research of that book, I began to read a lot of archival sources concerning the early European explorations, maritime explorations that we know of under the rubric of the Age of Discovery. And I was astounded in the pursuit of this work for that other book, as I read especially the accounts of the Portuguese and who made the earliest connections by Europeans with the so-called East, to learn that there was a period of time prior to this maritime engagement by the Iberians and especially the Portuguese with Asia, where the Portuguese were almost entirely preoccupied with connecting with West Africa. And as I happen to have a background also, as the introduction made clear, I mean, I'm a strange beast in that I work as a correspondent more than a decade in East Asia, but I've also spent very big chunks of my life working on Africa. And so this put me in a position to sort of process this in ways that I don't think some others might have. And I was especially astounded because I'm not just well-traveled, but I think of myself as a pretty curious-minded person, reasonably well-read person, pretty well-educated person. I had never seen this before. I had no inkling that Portugal had expended a tremendous amount of energy seeking, as a matter of priority, not as a secondary matter or as a byproduct of other things, but as a matter of priority, connecting with West Africa. And so this planted a seed in my mind. It wasn't important really to develop this storyline in my past book, which was intended and ended up being really about Chinese history, but I knew that I had to come back to this story. And so that's the nice little coincidence that sort of pulls this all together in terms of Taylor's invitation. But it's also very meaningful in ways that sort of are reflected in the choice of a title for my book. So my book, there are several elements. It's a long title: Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World. I'll give you a choice. Neither of these appear on the actual cover, but either colon or comma, 1471 to the Second World War. And so I'm going to talk about three elements in the title. I'm going to talk about Africa and Africans. I'm going to talk about modern or what modern world means. And I'm going to talk about the significance of the year 1471. We have limited amount of time, and there's really 600 years of history spanning four corners of the Atlantic that are covered in this book. And so I'm going to have to do a lot of compression and to rush through really significant chapters of the narrative here. But it's my contention, it's principal contention of this book, that the modern world, modern is a word of great contention and debate. There's no one definition that satisfies everyone, and that's okay, right? But I'm responding to the creation of the modern world in terms of how this is defined in the most common ways in the course of our education as non-specialists, meaning in grade school. or in junior high school and high school, or certainly by the time of introductory college history lessons, almost all of us learn a version of the story that the modern age begins with a European quest to find a maritime route to Asia. And that by accident, in fact, this results in the discovery of the Americas, that Christopher Columbus, in the employ of the Spanish at the time, was also trying to find a route to Asia. And in the the culmination of these discoveries of Asia, or a way to Asia by sea, set off modernity, meaning, and I'm going to give a very simple and not by any means comprehensive or indisputable or debatable definition of modernity, but meaning in the purpose of my usage, the interconnection of the world for the first time, broadly speaking. All of the continents come to be linked together, and global commerce takes off with a speed and with a reach that had never, an intensity that had never been experienced before ever in history, right? So this is the beginning of the modern world, as I'm using the term modern. And I believe, and I think you will probably agree, that the normal way we are taught about this is that it starts with this pursuit of a route via sea to Asia. So back to the archives. As I'm researching my passport, I find that, in fact, the Portuguese spent most of the 1400s not bound up in trying to find a route to Asia at all. They were interested in Asia. I don't make any contention that Asia didn't matter to them, that it didn't loom somewhere in their imagination, but they had a very different priority. And this is reflected in the record, the written contemporary record of the time. And in fact, of the actions that they took. And that the Portuguese, beginning in the early decades of the 1400s, 1430s, 1440s especially, venture out at sea with an obsession to connecting with West Africa for the purpose of establishing a trade in gold with West African kingdoms. And that the reason the Portuguese did this, I'm again compressing and simplifying, happy to take questions on any element of this, was that Portugal was a very young, still poor and very fragile kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula that was whose territory was coveted by, I'm going to, for the sake of simplicity, say by Spain. Spain did not exist. There were kingdoms in what we call Spain. We'll call it Spain for the purpose of conversation. But the Spanish wished to reabsorb Portugal back into their realm. And Portugal, being very poor and very weak and not having many interesting trade goods or resources of their own, their principal trade goods were, by the way, dried fish, salt, and cork, meaning the cork that you put in bottles. That's all they had. The Portuguese elaborated this strategy. I like to liken it to a moonshot. We need to come up with something, or else the Spanish are going to end up reconquering us and reabsorbing us back into their realm, and our kingdom will cease to exist. This was the Aviz, A-V-I-Z dynasty in Portugal. And so the Aviz dynasty becomes, as a matter of strategic priority, obsessed with, as I said, the gold trade in West Africa. And they establish and invest in, with their very meager resources, a series of voyages down the coast of West Africa, determined to discover the source of what they knew to be an enormous quantity of wealth in gold in West Africa. Let me just pause to say why this seized me so much, because I'm confident none of you, or few of you, I want to guess none of you, in learning the story of modernity that I sort of traced in the beginning of my remarks, has ever heard any of this. And that the idea that Portugal set out to connect with Africa was not part of the story of the discovery of a route to Asia. In fact, if you look at the literature on this in modern times, meaning especially in the last century or two, either Africa is not mentioned, or Africa is mentioned as an inert space, a place of no inherent interest of its own, and even as an obstacle, which presented simply a challenge of how to circumnavigate, right? There is almost no trace in non-archival literature of Africa as a place of not just inherent interest, intense inherent interest on the part of the Portuguese. And this is amazing because the record of the 15th century couldn't be clearer about this. Okay, so I'm going to do two things. I'm going to talk about how it is that the Portuguese got into their minds the idea that it might be worth investing in establishing trade ties with West Africa. And then I'm going to talk about the changes in the world that this unleashed. This culminates, by the way, jumping ahead, in 1471, which is why that date is in the title of my book. 1471 is the year that the Portuguese search for gold in West Africa finally culminates with the discovery in the place that is now the modern nation of Ghana, with a discovery of a super abundant supply of gold, which Portugal begins to trade in, and which in a very short period of time pays off. The moonshot pays off. And gold trade with Ghana, which what I'm calling Ghana, it was not called Ghana then. What I'm calling Ghana very quickly begins to amount to roughly a third of the entire crown revenue of Portugal. The name of the Portuguese treasury itself in this age was called the House of Guinea. Guinea was the name that the Portuguese used for sub-Saharan Africa. So the Portuguese treasury itself was called the House of Guinea because sub-Saharan Africa had become that important to Portugal. And so this trade is established in 1401. The route to India, Calicut, is not established, I think, until 1501 by Vasco da Gama. And almost, this is more surprising given the way this history is typically characterized, more surprisingly, the Portuguese don't actually expend very much energy trying to get to Asia between 1471 and 1501. What their priority is securing their trade with West Africa against the covetousness of the Spaniards, who actually mount a naval, what shall I call it, flotilla to try to seize control of the gold trade away from Portugal. And also in exploring other parts of Africa, because the Portuguese had curious notions, these were common in Europe at the time, a non-scientific view of things, a curious notion that if gold was abundant at certain latitude, then this must be a phenomenon based on latitude, that there must be gold all over that land. And so the Portuguese were determined that not to get to Asia by sea, but to explore those latitudes, because on the theory that this must be where gold is, right? Okay, so how did the Portuguese get this idea to reach, to establish, to invest so heavily in establishing as a matter of national survival and priority relations with West Africa? This idea dates from the previous century, meaning from the 14th century. In the early 14th century, I'm going to stand up and show you very quickly using this map. There was a very important kingdom in this region of West Africa called the Sahel, and I'm tracing its rough extent geographically, so it was enormous. This kingdom was called Mali. It was the successor to an earlier kingdom in roughly the same geography called, confusingly, Ghana, which has nothing to do with the modern nation state of Ghana. And this region of West Africa had traded in gold via North African intermediaries, had traded in gold with Europe via North African intermediaries since roughly the turn of the previous millennium. So from the year 800, 1000, thereabouts, a lot of European gold was sourced from West Africa, but via North African traders. So in the early 1300s, there is a king of this empire in Mali. It was an Islamic empire, who we have very strong reason to believe had a theory of the world which said that not only is the world round, which he would have learned from Islamic literature, this was well established in the Islamic world far earlier than it was known in Europe, but that there must be some land on the other side of the ocean. And so this ruler of Mali in the early 1300s named Abu Bakr II financed and organized 2 bids to cross the ocean. I'm not asserting here that he managed to cross the ocean or that anyone in Mali reached the other side of the ocean, but attempted to have 2 expeditions cross the ocean. West Africa did not have in this period, and for quite some time afterwards, did not have large masted sailing vessels. So these would have been, if you want to imagine what the technology was, very large, seaworthy certainly within coastal waters, but probably pretty dangerous for anything beyond that, dugouts. So we're talking 30, 50, maybe even 100 feet long dugouts, right? So he organized a flotilla of dugouts and provisioned them not just for food and water, but with lots of gold, because that was Mali's principal source of wealth, and sent the first expedition across to try to get across the Atlantic, which of course was not called the Atlantic, and in the hopes of establishing contact with some other world on the other side. So this is almost 2 centuries before Columbus reached it. A story that I'm also quite confident few, if any of you, have heard about before. The first of these expeditions fails. Very few survivors made it back, perhaps even only 1 survivor. And this survivor tells the king, Abu Bakr, about the existence of currents far offshore in the ocean where 2 seas seem to converge very violently, and that all of these boats, dugouts, were lost in the convergence of these currents. And so this king, Abu Bakr II, undaunted, says, I'm going to put together an even larger expedition, and I'm going to be at the helm myself. And we're going to find out what's on the other side of the ocean. And he stocked his boats with lots of gold and set out at sea. And interestingly, because we have a background in China, the number of ships used in the record of this, and I'll tell you about the record in a minute, was 10,000. That was certainly not 10,000 ships. Probably not remotely close to 10,000 ships, but as Taylor knows, in China, or in Chinese, 10,000 is a synonym of a lot, right? So it doesn't mean literally 10,000, right? Anyway, so this ruler sets out, the record says, at sea in the pursuit of this adventure, as I've described, and he never returns. It is almost certain that if this voyage existed, that he died at sea. How do we know this? And this is where the beginning of the modern world begins. We know this because in 1324, his successor, a man named Mansa Musa, who becomes the emperor of Mali, again, an Islamic empire, sets off overland on camelback with an enormous procession and 18 tons of gold in his bags on pilgrimage to Mecca, in the pursuit of which he stops for a prolonged stay, actually sets up tents for months in the shadow of the pyramids in Cairo. And Mansa Musa distributed so much gold in patronage and diplomatic acts and Islamic charity and things like that from these 18 tons that he had brought with him, that the price of gold in the wide Mediterranean world collapsed for 10 years or more. No one had ever seen that much gold, and suddenly the market was flooded with gold. And so word of Malian wealth in gold then spreads into Europe very rapidly. And this is the idea that the Portuguese become seized with. And it culminates with Henry the Navigator in the 1430s and 1440s saying that this should be our priority. We've got to find that before anybody else finds it. Okay, so the Portuguese in 1471, oh, by the way, I said I'll tell you how we know these things. We know these things because Mansa Musa, during his stay in Cairo, which was under the control of the Mamluk dynasty, has a number of court seances in the Mamluk Empire. And there are record tapes, there are scribes writing down the accounts of the conversation that Mansa Musa gave of his dynasty and his rule and whatnot. And so these come down to us via the written accounts of the Mamluk dynasty based on this diplomatic account. Right? This is not a fantasy. This is not oral history. This was written down by the Mamluks at the time, right? So in 1471, the Portuguese, again, I'm compressing a lot. It takes them decades to overcome Europe's own lack of technology in terms of maritime navigation and Europe's superstitions about the world being flat and there being dragons at sea and fall off the edge, and also importantly that the equator is basically like hell, meaning not just really hot but like hell hot, like unsurvivable hot, right? So the Europeans set down the coast of West Africa and they finally arrive in this place called Ghana, which I've talked about earlier. It wasn't called at the time. By this time, Henry the Navigator, the key prince in the Aviz dynasty, who was the sort of organizer and motivating force by these exploratory voyages, had died, but the Portuguese continued. 1471, they arrive in Ghana, they establish this incredible trade. The Spanish, getting wind of, I'm sorry to use the word wind because I have to use it right away, but the Spanish, the Portuguese having won this windfall in trade in gold with Ghana, the Spanish quickly learn of this and decide, okay, we have to take this over. The Spanish send a flotilla of ships to try to win control of the West African trade in gold from the Portuguese. The Portuguese had intelligence about this, maritime and diplomatic intelligence, and laid a trap for the Spanish. And even though the Spanish flotilla was far bigger than the Portuguese presence, the Portuguese had the advantage of surprise and won that encounter. And the Spanish basically never tried again to frontally take over the trade in gold from Ghana. What the Spanish did, very interestingly, was decide that since Portugal had reaped such profit from exploration of the tropics, maybe Spain should try to explore the tropics too. The Vatican had given sanction to Portugal's control over Africa, meaning over, in that moment, control over trade with West Africa. So the Portuguese had legal advantages by this point. It was hard for the Spanish to contest this anymore. The Spanish then resolved that they're going to, for the first time, become big explorers too. So this all grows out of contact with West Africa, which I'm, again, confident most, maybe all of you, none of you have ever heard of this, right? And so Christopher Columbus, who had been touring the capitals of Europe with this strange idea, strange for the context of, in the context of Europe at this age, this idea that the world was actually round and that you could reach Asia by going west. Christopher Columbus had previously been declined by the Spanish crown, backing by the Spanish crown. Christopher Columbus had been declined backing by England also. Christopher Columbus's brother spent some time in England trying to convince the English to finance his voyage. Now that Portugal has established that the tropics are rich, Spain, deciding it had to keep up with Portugal in the acquisition of wealth through the tropics, decided to fund Christopher Columbus's voyages. And this is how the three ships that he put together, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, came about and ended up discovering the Americas, discovering America. It's worth noting, since none of this survives in the sort of conventional telling of history, that Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama and Bartholomew Diaz, these are probably the three preeminent explorers of this age, all worked prior to the discovery, prior to their famous discoveries, meaning in the case of Columbus, the Americas, and those latter two, da Gama and Diaz, the Indian Ocean and the route to Asia. They all worked for a period of years, ferrying trade back and forth to Ghana, where Portugal in 1482 built a major fort which survives today. It's an enormous thing at a place called Elmina. All three of these monumentally famous figures in the history of the modern age actually cut their teeth in West Africa, even though West Africa figures almost nowhere in any of the conventional accounts of this history. And Christopher Columbus is like Jesus Christ. I mean, there's few people that more books have been written about. I've read not even 10% of them, because there are so many, but I couldn't find almost any books about Christopher Columbus that mention any of this. Okay, so why is this important? First of all, the Portuguese, being as poor as I described, don't have any trade goods that the West Africans want. The Portuguese advantages in technology and material culture, in fact, were not very great, if they existed at all, over the more, West Africa is not a homogeneous landscape, so over the more sophisticated societies of West Africa, right? And so the Portuguese arrive in this place we're calling Ghana, at a place called Elmina, and they discover the Ghanaians, that's not what they were called, but we're going to say that, were perfectly willing to trade for gold with them, but they didn't want anything that the Portuguese had. And so the Portuguese had to go find things that the Ghanaians wanted, and this sent them back to Europe looking for trade goods that would appeal to the West African. And this ends up creating circuits of trade, very important, establishing important circuits of trade which had not existed or which had been very tenuous prior to this within Europe, between Iberia and with northern parts of Europe, especially Germany and the so-called Low Countries, for goods that the West Africans would be willing to trade for gold with. And primary among these were worked metal goods, iron, brass, bronze, and also to some extent cloth, although there was a problem with cloth because European cloths in this era prior to the industrialization were almost entirely wool-based or flaxen-based, right? And Ghana is a tropical place, and so those tend to be heavy fabrics, and so there was a limited interest in Ghana. Anyway, so this establishes not just the contact of Iberia with West Africa, but circuits of trade within West Africa. So the Portuguese, giving you their geographic notions about, how latitude influences the distribution of metals, right? And so the Portuguese become wrapped up in exploring Africa long before their true pursuit of maritime connections with East Asia or with Asia. This is almost all that they do for the next 30 years. And in the pursuit of this exploration, they find an island right on the equator which we now know as Sao Tome, St. Thomas, which was uninhabited. And I can point to it again just for convenience sake. And as it happens, Sao Tome is right here. So not far off the coast of Africa, and it's uninhabited. Right on the equator. Volcanic, incredibly rich soils. Right around this time, by historical coincidence, the Portuguese had begun the cultivation of sugar far to the north in the Atlantic, at an island called Madeira and the Canary Islands. Sugar is a crop that throughout history has been associated with forced labor or slavery. And the reason for that is sugar cultivation is one of the most physically demanding and unpleasant crops that you can imagine. It is extraordinarily trying and even violent. The leaves of sugarcane are like razor, and you have to go into the field and have to find a way to cut this without cutting yourself to death. And so sugar, everywhere it's been cultivated, sugar probably originates in Malaysia or Indonesia or New Guinea or somewhere like that, right? It makes a very gradual transit across the Asian continent into the Eastern Mediterranean and finally down the coast of West Africa via the Portuguese, right? Sugar was, refined sugar was an extraordinarily expensive luxury good prior to the events that I'm describing in Sao Tome. It was only royalty and their courts could afford to consume sugar, and it was in many cases considered a medicinal, which is odd given how we think about sugar today. Anyway, the Portuguese had begun to experiment with sugar further north in the Atlantic, and some unknown Portuguese said, let's try it here in Sao Tome. So they planted sugar in Sao Tome, and they discovered that it grows much better at that latitude and with that kind of volcanic island and rainfall patterns than it did anywhere they had seen before. And so they get the idea, no Portuguese wanted to grow sugar and get sliced up in the cane fields. Let's source human beings on the African coast and bring them, enslave them, and put them to work growing sugar for us. I'm compressing and I'm accelerating here vastly, but this is really one of the most important events in the history of humanity. In my argument, this is the most important event in the modern age prior to industrialization, this innovation. And the innovation in question is the invention of the industrial prison labor camp that operates on a racial basis. You've never probably heard that phrase before, industrial prison labor camp. I'm using it with great deliberation as a more appropriate way of saying the term that you are all certainly familiar with, which is the plantation. This is where the slave plantation takes full form and is perfected as an economic entity for the first time in history by the Portuguese for the purposes of growing sugar. And this is, think of this as being as revolutionary event as the Industrial Revolution itself. So we're talking about the very early years of the 1500s, so the start of the 16th century. At that very same time, by historical accident, the Portuguese discovered Brazil. They discovered Brazil not because they were looking for Asia or because they were trying to find Brazil. They discovered Brazil because they were still trying to explore Africa, and they had figured out that the best way to get down the African coast was tacking westward into the Atlantic and then tacking back east. So by making these big pyramidal navigational legs, they could get down the African coast much more quickly than by hugging the African coast. And so when you tack far enough at that latitude, as you can see, you hit Brazil. And so the Portuguese discover Brazil in this period, and because in a relatively short period of time take over Brazil. And this innovation called the plantation, which I think is a travesty of a euphemism, it's really an industrial prison labor camp where productivity is extracted violently and under intense supervision and coercion from one class of human beings by another on a racial basis, and a racial basis not only concerning the individual who's being exploited at any given time, but under a new institution that was formed in tandem with this plantation system called chattel, which means not only that it's legitimate to enslave people on a racial basis, but that their descendants and the descendants of their descendants in perpetuity should also legitimately be considered property of other people. This all comes together in Sao Tome. It transits the Atlantic to Brazil, and this is the most important event prior to industrialization in the world in terms of wealth creation. So I worked for many years in East Asia, and my previous book prior to this one, as I said, is a work of Chinese history. And in China and in Japan and the Koreas, I can't count the number of conversations I've had, fascinating conversations with East Asians trying to process this moment in history that has come to be known as the divergence. When Europe, and subsequently what I'm going to call the West, and I'll define the West in a minute, but when Europe first begins to diverge from, first of all, catch up to, and then diverge from Asia in terms of wealth and power. And so I discovered as a correspondent in Asia all kinds of theory and discussion and debate about why this happened, how it happened, when it happened, what does it mean, about the West, what does it say about us, what are the lessons of this, et cetera, et cetera. This is all based in the events that I described. And I'm going to try to tell you in a very compressed and telegraphic way what I mean by that. So a lot of the stories that I'm telling you are based on erasure or effacement. These are not new facts. These facts exist in the archives. You have to want to see them in order to discover them and to contemplate and to consider their significance. But I didn't really discover any of this first time to me due to some genius that I possessed. Not at all. I simply read the archives, and this is all there. The most famous story of the beginning of the modern age, as I said, is the connection of continents via the age of discovery, and this is supposedly about, a pursuit of contact with Asia by sea. The most famous story about the acquisition of wealth in the New World in the early period of modernity is, I believe, or involves, I believe, the Spanish conquistadors, who land in places like Mexico and in Bolivia and Peru and places like that, and against very long odds, they, with small numbers of daunted, individuals, they take on, with their guns, germs, and steel, they take on, the hordes of Native American societies and defeat them. And the wealth part of that comes in with the carting off across the oceans, first back to Spain directly, but subsequently in trade with China, of large amounts of precious metals, especially silver and also gold. And so to the extent we tend conventionally to talk about the obtention of wealth by European society from the New World in the early modern age, those are the most important stories, the most prominent stories. In fact, that's a distortion of the reality. So it is fairly easy to show, to demonstrate that Portugal, by virtue of its extraordinarily rapid expansion of the production of sugar and the rendering of sugar in the space of less than a generation from an incredibly exorbitant luxury item to an item of mass consumption, the Portuguese reaped more profit from the prison industrial labor camp than the Spaniards did from the conquest of the great empires of Latin America in metals. There's something more astounding than this. So in 1630, actually 1630, there's two dates, I want to be simple here. 1627, the English take control of the island of Barbados in the Eastern Caribbean, not far from the South American mainland. It was uninhabited at the time. The English, in their very first visit for the purpose of settlement of Barbados, they brought slaves with them. The English, African slaves. The English, having observed the rapid expansion of wealth that the Portuguese had acquired via this industrial prison labor complex that I described to you, set out to grow sugar on Barbados. From the middle decades of the 1600s to the end of that century, the English on the sole island of Barbados made more money from the exploitation of human beings, let's say in plantations, growing sugar for re-export back to Europe, than the Spanish carted off across the oceans of gold and silver. Very famous thing, what the Spanish did, right? You've never heard of the generation of wealth on a comparable scale in a place as small, in such a compressed period of time, in a space as small as Barbados. Barbados, by the way, is, in terms of its geography, is 1/3 the size of the city of Los Angeles. Okay, so in the space of less than a half a century, by importing and working to death, and literally working to death, the average life expectancy from arrival to death of an enslaved person growing sugar in that environment was between 5 and 7 years. So literally working to death, 300,000 people brought from Africa. The English obtained more wealth than all of the Spanish galleons managed to carry back in those very famous exploits from the New World. Okay, so this is a process. The British emulate the Portuguese. They're late to the game. This is the approximate start of British imperialism. The British, late in the 1600s, they defeat the Spanish and take control of a much bigger island called Jamaica. They introduce the same model in Jamaica and make even more fabulous wealth in Jamaica using the same patterns of prison industrial labor camps. And the French, having been the great historical rivals of the English in this period, I should say the British by this time, decide that they must do this too. And so the French also start out in the Eastern Caribbean in places like Guadeloupe and Martinique, but this eventually spreads to a much bigger island that the French shared control of with the Spanish. We know of the island as Hispaniola. This French colony there was called Saint-Domingue. Okay, the French began to cultivate sugar in Saint-Domingue in the 1730s, and by the 1770s, Saint-Domingue, using this exact same model, accounts for 2/3 of France's overseas trade. In the era of France's most rapid ascension in terms of wealth and power in the world. The colony of Saint-Domingue becomes, and I think this is reflected in some reasonably common historical, conventional history. The colony of Saint-Domingue becomes known as the richest colony in the history of colonization by far. By the way, the English colonies in the Caribbean were far more important economically to England and subsequently to Britain than the American colonies that became the United States, immeasurably more. And in fact, the very economic survival of the 13 original American colonies was predicated, and this is documented in my book, and I think it's fairly uncontroversial to those who are willing to discuss facts. The economic survival of the 13 colonies was heavily based on provisioning the English sugar colonies in the Caribbean. And that is because the production of sugar through this industrial prison labor model was so profitable that it made no economic sense to conduct any other kind of economic activity on those islands. The land was too productive and too profitable in producing sugar, right? And therefore, the 13 colonies provided everything they needed for consumption and hardware and furnishings and tools, what have you, right? That was the basis of economic life of the 13 colonies. We don't really get taught this, but it is completely documented, right? Okay, another interesting tidbit. The per capita wealth of an Englishman in Jamaica was 30 times higher than the per capita wealth of an Englishman in the American colony on average, right? Which should give you an idea of the sort of the nature of the economic vigor in these two different domains. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead again and move to another theme of my book, which is that in 1791, the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue, as the French knew their colony on Hispaniola, rose up in revolt. And it's important to describe these people as Africans. These were not Haitians, they were Africans. And I insist on calling them Africans because given that the survival rate, the longevity of people brought to grow sugar on these islands was 5 to 7 years, anyone who was growing sugar was born in Africa. If you only live 5 to 7 years once they put you to work, that means you were born somewhere else, right? And the slaves were drawn from many different parts of West and Central Africa. And this was a matter of deliberate strategy on the part of Europeans who felt, logically enough, that if you concentrate enough Africans they may have a low idea of Africans, right? But they all knew well enough that if you concentrate enough people from one place together, they're going to be able to organize and to revolt. And so they very deliberately tried to mix people from very disparate origins in Africa when they put them under this regime of plantation agriculture. Nonetheless, in 1791, the Africans on Saint-Domingue rose up and fought for their freedom and overthrew the French a first time, after which the Spanish and then the British each tried to take over the island. The British sent its largest maritime naval expedition ever across the Atlantic in the pursuit of establishing control over France's former colony and lost. They had to retreat. This is nowhere emphasized in British education of this period. There's no regimental flag or honor paid to the 50,000 British people who died and tried to take control of or assume control of Haiti. And then the French tried again under Napoleon and were defeated a second time. Also, the largest naval expedition that the French ever sent overseas. The Africans won against all odds. And in 1804, they established, for the first time, a nation which results from a slave revolt. And that nation is, of course, the nation of Haiti. And Haiti, as I argue in the book, becomes the first state in the world to fully enact, as a matter of law and constitution, the most basic and fundamental idea of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment, which we celebrate and we think of as the product of European thought and values and ideals, and we emphasize the high thinking of our founders in this regard, and the British and the French also do similarly with regards to grand figures in that era in their countries. It only really takes shape in the application, in reality, as a result of a slave uprising. And so what do I mean by the most basic and fundamental value of the Enlightenment? I mean the legal establishment and enforcement of the idea that all people are created equal, regardless of race, color, geography, language, background, class, what have you. The Haitians made this a matter from the founding of their country. First time this has ever happened in history, as a matter of their basic law. The United States doesn't, as we all know, ban slavery, end slavery. So this is 1804 in Haiti, right? Until 1865. And I'm a good deal older than most of the people in this room. Legal discrimination doesn't end in this country for the most part until my child. So Haiti is far advanced in this regard. You may object that, yes, Haiti is a troubled country today. I'm happy to talk about that. But how could it be that they're so troubled today, but you're claiming that they were so enlightened or embraced such noble ideas back then? Happy to take that up, right? There's another point to pursue before I stop, and that is that the success of the Haitians in rising up against their enslavement and defeating the three great imperial forces of this time put the fear, lit a terror in the minds of young American leaders, meaning of the American Republic, of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, people of that era, that if Black people could defeat the three great imperial forces in a place like Haiti, well, maybe it's not such a good idea to concentrate Black people so heavily as we have done, we Americans had done, in places like Virginia and other areas of the so-called Old South, meaning South Carolina, Georgia, etc. And so this sets in motion a grand scheme, most famously championed by Thomas Jefferson, to disperse the African population around the new territories of the United States and to thin out their numbers in Virginia and the rest of the Old South because of the peril that would seek to represent in the minds of American leaders in this point. This scheme of Thomas Jefferson is grandly facilitated by the victory of the enslaved peoples over Napoleon, who is, because he had sent such a large force to try unsuccessfully to prevail in putting down this revolt, nearly bankrupted his nation. And France, as a result, ends up selling what's called the Louisiana Purchase to the young Republic of the United States under Thomas Jefferson. This doubles the size of the United States, literally doubles, and adds what are presently 15, all or part of 15 states, concentrated in the central region of the United States and centered on the Mississippi Valley. And as Thomas Jefferson pursues this deliberate dispersal of slaves out of the Old South, sold at great profit and marched by foot westward in chains to the areas acquired from France. These populations, in what I describe as the second great migration, the first one being across the ocean itself, are put to work growing cotton. And cotton becomes, in an extraordinarily short period of time, the economic engine of the young United States. There's almost no cotton grown in the United States before 1790. By the 1820s, cotton is the most important export of the United States. And the production numbers are doubling and quadrupling every few years. The data are in my book. The numbers are astounding. It's astronomical. Cotton becomes, by a very large distance, the most important export of the young United States. The most valuable commodity, in the world. And cotton becomes the basis, although as unrecognized as many other elements of this history are, of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, which we credit to cleverness and entrepreneurial spirit and ingenuity and engineering, since I'm at MIT in England and concentrated in a region of that country called Lancashire. People figure out how to make looms and how to, organize processes that rapidly increase the sort of productivity of workers. All of that is predicated on the supply of cotton. All of those textiles, literally all of those textiles are cotton textiles. And the cotton is sourced overwhelmingly in the Mississippi Valley. And that production is the result of a prison industrial labor camp model, which originates in Sao Tome, which I described to you earlier in my story, and makes this long transit to Brazil, up the Caribbean, into the United States, and culminates in the creation of the thing that I'm calling the West. The West is a term that gets thrown around very lightly and very vaguely, and people seldom pause to, it's used with great imprecision and just clumsiness. People seldom pause to consider what the West really means. As I use the term the West for the purposes of this discussion, I mean a condominium, economically and politically speaking, between Western Europe and North America, and especially centered on Great Britain and Anglophone North America, and even more especially with the United States. And I think that's a good rough definition, even down to this moment, of what the West means. Right? But this was all built and predicated on the economic model of exploitation on a racial basis through an institution called chattel slavery that extracted by force production of commodities out of one type of human being from another type of human being. And I've tried as quickly and as compressed the fashion as reasonable to kind of trace the broad outlines of that for you just now, and I'm happy to take whatever questions you have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Howard. That was absolutely terrific. Got about 25 minutes for questions. I'll keep a list. For those of you on Zoom, please do raise your hand. In the Zoom feature, I will be trying to go to you as well. So everyone, let's see, I see Wright, you have the first question, but everyone else. Right? Actually, Wright, can you come up to the microphone?
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Wright. I'm a third-year PhD student. So I think what your talk really drove home to me was, more than anything, the sense of the scale of this wealth, that it's mind-bogglingly massive how much value is being created through this work. And what I was wondering if you could address is, you know, we think a lot about the IR realism in this department, and one of the main periods that we like to look at for that point of view is early modern Europe and the formation of the different European states and how they, you know, competed with each other. I was wondering if you could connect the extraction of wealth by these different European powers to their competition with each other in Europe, whether that, in your telling, either tips the balance of some conflicts, whether it serves to create some of the antagonisms that the European states struggle over, or any other ways you could connect it. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. That's a great question. Two things. First thing I want to say is that there are lots of sources of wealth in the ambit of the narrative that I described. So in a much earlier period of history, meaning in a much earlier historical period, there was a great debate about how important, economically speaking, was the trade in human beings that we call the slave trade itself were, and whether the value locked up in the profit in trading human beings was important to Europe's takeover, right? And that went back and forth over time. And it's a very interesting debate. And it is indisputable that trade itself was I am not one of those who argues was the principal driver of the grand divergence between Europe and other parts of the world, but was a big factor in creating just the simple trade in human beings, was a big factor in wealth creation in Europe. And lots of very big historic European banks, and especially British banks and insurance companies, have their histories grounded in that very trade. Okay. When I spoke about sugar, cotton subsequently becoming immeasurably greater in economic importance than extraction of things like gold and silver by the Spanish, and immeasurably is the right word. Little Barbados was a much bigger source of wealth than all of that extraction. Okay, I'm actually not even telling you half of the story. The fuller story has to bring in the secondary and tertiary industries that were built on that production of sugar and trade in sugar. And those industries, a short list would include shipping and transportation including railroads, banking, insurance, processing of various kinds, et cetera, right? When you combine the profits of those things, you end up with a better picture of the enormity of what we're talking about in terms of the impact on the trajectories, economically speaking, of Western Europe, and especially of Britain, and of what becomes the United States. Okay, so your second question, which I'm really thankful for in this specific place where we're sitting, is how do we correlate these things with events in Europe in terms of the relative fortunes of different European countries? Am I understanding you correctly? So it turns out that some of the most interesting work on this topic was done by some people at MIT, and I quote them in my book, famous people. So there's this team that has collaborated on lots of papers and books, Darren Acemoglu, Robinson, and what's the third person's name? I'm forgetting my...
Johnston?
Yes. Okay. So there's a paper that I saw of theirs that's on this exact question that I found and read and cited in my book, which talks about, I think their term is the Atlantic effect. The effect of Atlantic trading. And it correlates economic development and wealth in European societies to the exposure of different European societies, or better said, the involvement of European societies in trade across the Atlantic over a period of 500 years, and establishes an exact correlation between economic outcomes and the intensity of, it doesn't speak about the nature of the trade, but the intensity of the trade across the Atlantic. And so the countries that started first in trading across the Atlantic take off, so to speak, earliest. And those are all coastal countries for obvious reasons in Europe because they have access to the Caribbean. European trade had been focused on the Mediterranean prior to the European maritime trade. Naval sea trade was a Mediterranean thing prior to the transatlantic trade. And they first diverged strongly from the Mediterranean-based countries, very strongly, markedly, right? And then over time, other countries get involved. And so it becomes important. They assess the intensity of transatlantic trade. Okay, so they don't really, this is not a paper about slavery per se. But what was being traded? In these 500 years, the only things worth mentioning that were being traded were either human beings or the products that human beings were producing. That was the bulk of that was the trade, right? And so your three scholars here at MIT have provided, and I'm sorry, I can, if after the talk, I don't have a copy of my book with me, but this paper is cited in the book. It's extraordinarily powerfully done. If you want to follow up on this, I suggest you look for it.
Thanks. Let's go to the Zoom. And Nina Pullman, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much for an interesting talk. I was wondering, how do you think the history should be taught at the grade school level in the US? Say if you could write the textbook on this history, what would you do differently? And if we did teach history in this alternative way that you would propose, how do you think the discourse on race would be different in the US? Like how does the history and the way we think and teach history shape discourse around these issues today? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think there's a very strong connection. I'm not really an expert in pedagogy of history, and so I want to be modest in the way I respond to your question. I think that there's something, there's a feature of human beings about history that's worth exploring here that involves a phenomenon that I will call hagiography. And hagiography, to be simple about it, means writing a nice story about oneself or about someone with whom one is associated. And I think this is actually a common, perhaps even universal feature of history. So China, I'm involved with China, topically speaking, and if you limit yourself to mainstream Chinese accounts of Chinese history, they are shot through with self-flattering and exceptionalist stories about what it means to be Chinese and what has Chinese people done over time. And that these notions don't really bear up to very close examination in a room in which the air is not sealed, right? And so this is not to single out China. The point is actually quite the opposite, that this is true, if anything, even truer of the way we as Westerners discuss our history. And what am I getting at? Hagiography means emphasizing the things that allow you to feel virtuous about yourself. And so that's how we teach history. We look for sources of brilliance and nobility and enterprise and high-mindedness and virtue in our own past to explain our present and to explain, to the extent we have succeeded, to explain our success. And in America, that results in a kind of exceptionalism every bit as much as, maybe more, than the exceptionalism in China that I just described, right? So I don't really know how to get over that. I mean, I don't have any illusions that I've written a book that's going to suddenly change the way everybody, literally, I mean, some people's minds will be changed, but it's not going to change everybody's mind. That's impossible. But how do you teach this? If I could write a textbook, or if I were involved in that sort of process, I write in the very opening passage of my book that it would be very strange to write a history that ends up in the right place if you don't start in the right place, right? And actually, I'm paraphrasing myself crudely. I think I said it more elegantly in the pages of the book. But the point is, as I tried to show in this talk, we tell a travestied story about the start of the modern world, which leaves out super important and I think principally important elements of how this all began. And so that would be a good place to begin. That the modern world isn't. There's nothing against Asia, but the modern world didn't actually start with trying to discover Asia, and that Africa was not considered to be an empty space, inert, without merits or interests of its own, and that it was not simply an obstacle to be circumnavigated, and that there were societies in Africa that held their own quite well against or with in discourse, intercourse, exchange, commerce with Europe in the early modern period for a very long time, into the 1600s. There were kingdoms in Congo, a kingdom in Central Africa, spelled with a K, Congo, which had diplomats all throughout Europe and which had priests ordained by the Vatican, including archbishops, who has people buried in the Vatican. They became so celebrated and revered within Roman Catholicism. These people traded as equals with the Europeans for a very long time. We have no notion of that. We only have a notion, if we ever pause to think about Africa, as a primitive place or as an inert place. And that's just a travesty of the reality. So how do you address this in conventional grade school education? I just think you start with some simple truth. I don't think you have to beat people over the head with it. But you have to, you just have to speak to the facts.
So sticking on the Zoom, I see Steve Van Evera. Steve?
Hi, this was a great talk. I learned so much from it. I have one question, so little, maybe you're just, I'm asking you to cure my ignorance, but I was taken with this book by Ibram Kendi called Stamped from the Beginning, and his discussion of the slave trade in the 15th century says that it was significant enough for the Portuguese to be developing a whole ideology of racism in order to justify it. He says that Henry the Navigator basically was, he reoriented his commerce around a business model of extracting, kidnapping slaves from West Africa because the price of slaves from East Europe went up because the East European Slavs were defending themselves better. But there's a lot of slave trade in Europe, according to him, before the 16th century, and a lot of it was in the Slavic slaves. That really became more difficult. But then, when the Portuguese learned better navigation, Henry the Navigator was the first guy to specialize in slave trade in sub-Saharan Africans. And one of the first things he did was hire a guy named Gomez Inez de Zurara to write a book that justified it. And de Zurara wrote the first great racist book, which was very widely read and appreciated by slave traders around the world. But the timing is just off with your story. In other words, you're really saying slave trade got going later. And Kenny doesn't say there was a lot of sub-Saharan slave trading, but he says it was enough to get the Portuguese kind of focused intellectually on justifying it and developing the whole concept of white supremacy, which didn't exist before.
Sure. I'm not sure what the exact question is, but I'm going to work with what I've heard.
Well, how do the stories relate? And is Kendi, what about 1400 slave trade? What slave trade was there?
Great. So there's things that I agree with and things I disagree with in the, I haven't read that book. So I'm not, from what I've heard, I'm not really going to argue with the fundaments of what you said, but the interpretations that are being made. It is indisputable that in the 1400s, as the Portuguese, under the impulsion of Henry the Navigator, begin these explorations down the West African coast, begin to engage in what we're calling the slave trade. This is prior to the discovery of the Americas, okay? This is indisputable. And Zurara is one of several figures who writes about this in the time, and I've read all of his accounts, okay? So what was really going on? Henry the Navigator was not principally involved with or even interested in the slave trade or trading in slaves. And I don't say that because I think Henry the Navigator was a good guy or a bad guy. I don't think in those terms about most historical figures. Henry the Navigator was obsessed, as I said, with finding the gold in Africa. Henry the Navigator was the third son of the king of Portugal. He could never become the king himself, and had a sort of limited ambit within to maneuver. And he knew that he, as the third son in a pretty poor kingdom, didn't have an unlimited draw on resources. And again, remember my term moonshot. This is a moonshot. The Portuguese are making a long odds bet that they can somehow establish this lucrative trade in gold. And it takes decades. And you have to finance these voyages down the coast of Africa. For a poor kingdom like Portugal, this was a big expense, right? And so the Portuguese settle upon fairly early, once they had had these first 2-3 experiences of exploration and not having found gold in any interesting quantity, of saying, we've got to find a way to fund this in the meantime. And so buying slaves, actually initially capturing slaves through coastal expeditions, raiding, becomes the Portuguese strategy, not to engage in slave trading itself, but to keep funding these voyages, to sustain this effort. And so the Portuguese began focusing on, as I said, Africa is not a homogeneous social, political, economic, or whatever environment. It's very diverse and mixed in terms of the landscape. Focusing on, in this initial period, on places where there were relatively unorganized societies, not great kingdoms, and coming ashore and capturing people, and then taking them back for sale into Europe in order to sell these people to finance further voyage. This becomes a major feature of Portuguese exploration in the 1440s and 50s. And it takes on such an amplitude that, as I say in my book, after a few decades of this, the population of Lisbon itself becomes 10% Black. If you go ask a reasonably well-educated Portuguese person today, they have no idea. There are almost no visual traces or even archival traces of this left in the records in Portugal. But 10% of Lisbon became Black as a result of this. And Seville, which was the operational center of this precise pre-transatlantic slave trade in Spain, also becomes a place of high concentrations of Black people. The European interest in acquiring human beings from Africa, who we shorthandedly call slaves, was based on the recent experience of the Black Death. That European populations had been decimated by the Black Death, and that, there was a great demand for workers. And as you say, a lot of these workers had been sourced in an intra-European slave trade. There's a historian named Peter Frankopan who has written a book called The Silk Roads, plural, which gets into this intra-European slave trade very interestingly. But this early trade, prior to the transatlantic trade in human beings, becomes a supplement to that and eventually surpasses that in volume. It becomes the source in Southern Europe of labor for menial and unpleasant work, right? And most importantly, it finances the continuation of this pursuit of the moonshot by Portugal to discover the source of wealth in West Africa.
Thanks. Nina Miller.
My question's been asked, so I can see my time.
Okay. Rich Nielsen.
For the mic. Hi, Rich Nielsen, associate professor here. Very simple question. I felt like I missed how the Portuguese managed to parlay trading European goods for the gold at the start of the story. I get that they seized a lot of wealth by seizing people later, but I was unclear how the beginning of that wealth generation process happened.
Sure. So prior to discovering gold, the Portuguese had begun discovering other things, other goods in the West African environment that had great value on European marketplaces. One of those were various kinds of spices and peppers. Another one was the organs of a cat, the mammal cat called the civet cat, from which perfumes were made. And so the Portuguese were, this is where this all begins. The Portuguese, along the way, in the pursuit of gold, had established markets for themselves in those sorts of products and took those back to Europe. And once they had discovered the abundance of wealth in what we're calling Ghana, then used those goods to prime this new trade in these circuits with Northern Europe for other goods that they could then take back down the coast of Africa to sell in exchange for gold.
Back to the Zoom, Nick Ackert.
Hi, Howard. My name's Nick. I'm a third-year student in the program. Thank you so much for a really interesting talk. And part of the sin of being in political science is that every time we encounter interesting empirical information, we try to create a theory around what we see. And so because of that, the part of your story that I'd really like to hear more about was Portugal's decision to take this enormous risk that you call a long odds bet, particularly in West Africa. And as you present the story, there seem to be two elements of this. And one is definitely material, right, as news of Mansa Musa's wealth circulates around the European continent. But there also seems to be a sociological element to this too, right, about a racial hierarchy and the obligations of certain people and their destiny as kind of indentured servants and slaves. And so my question is, how do powers like Portugal with limited resources really decide where they're going to invest? And is there some kind of a pattern you've observed, particularly from the archives, that explains their willingness to really take a bet that could take decades to pay off?
Sure. Interesting question. So a lot of this is dictated by geography. So Portugal is at the outside lip or edge of the Mediterranean world. The Mediterranean Sea was the most important economic space in Europe for all of history prior to the period we're talking about. Wealth and trade through Europe was vehiculated by sea travel and exchanges across the Mediterranean for basically forever, right? Literally back to the earliest recorded history between Proto-Greece and Egypt and things like that, right? Portugal didn't have any access to the Mediterranean Sea. Between Portugal and the Mediterranean sat Spain, and Spain coveted control of Portugal. And so Portugal didn't have really the option of trying to become a big player in the Mediterranean. They had to look outside of the Mediterranean and what's left for them, right? They're poor, they don't really have any means, but they have this really long ocean front looking out onto the Atlantic. And so it strikes me as pretty obvious that they would begin to think of the solutions as having to stem from their access to the Atlantic. And Portugal and Iberia in general, and even Italy and much of the rest of Europe had long experience of trade with North Africa and empire with North Africa and being colonized in fact themselves by North Africa, right? Spain had been under the control of North Africans for centuries at one point, and the Romans had colonies in North Africa, and the Greeks had traded with North Africa. So Africa wasn't, prior to the story of Mansa Musa, which becomes this great motivating device, it wasn't that Europeans thought that they were ignorant of the notion that there was this place called Africa, right? There was history of trade with Africa, just not direct trade with what is sometimes called Black Africa, right? And so Mansa Musa becomes the sort of proximate cause of that. I don't think of this as being such an unusual story that they should have established their moonshot on knowing what they knew of Mansa Musa, of trying to establish. In fact, the record is very clear. They write this in the time. That's what they're trying to do. This is their obsession. I don't think it's, given their geographic position, I don't think it's unusual that they should have established an Atlantic-based strategy like this. I think that I sort of feel like there was a question about racial hierarchy or ideas of race that I lost in this question. And if you want to, if I'm correct and you want to elaborate on that, I'm happy to return to.
I think we're short on time, but thank you. That was very helpful.
Thank you.
Great, so we are at the end of our seminar. So thank you so much, Howard. That's absolutely terrific. I know that I learned more than one thing today. And I'm sure when I read the book, I'll be learning even more. So everyone, please join me in thanking Howard.